It's not hard to argue that ChatGPT and other popular AI models have become what seems like a staple in everyday life. But recently, there's been some turmoil around the environmental impacts of AI. Specifically, the claim that has been turning the most heads is that ChatGPT consumes half a liter of water per prompt. And just to give you a sense of how much water that is, this is half a liter. So I did some research. Today I'm going to be talking about whether or not that is actually true, why people are worried about ChatGPT's water usage, and the impacts that big media companies have on people when it comes to environmental statistics. So to understand why ChatGPT actually uses so much water, we first have to understand how it actually works. So when you give ChatGPT a prompt, the prompt is not actually processed on your device. It's instead sent to these giant Microsoft Azure data centers in Texas, and those centers are what actually do the thinking behind your prompt. And basically, once the prompt is processed, they send it back to you. And this is why you need to have internet connection in order to use ChatGPT. ChatGPT processes anywhere from 200 million to 1 billion requests per day. The average energy use varies depending on the source, but most estimates come out to around 300 megawatt hours per day. This is equivalent to 1.08 trillion joules. These high-power computers produce a lot of heat and need to be cooled down constantly in order to be maintained, and this is where the water is used. But you might be wondering, if the water is being used to cool the computers, why is water being consumed and not just reused? Well, the short answer is that it takes too much energy. The most common type of liquid cooling is called closed-loop cooling. How it works is water will move along this pipe here, and it'll collect heat from the computer at the start and be cooled down by a fan at this part. And basically, once the water is cool, it then comes around and then is cool enough that it can collect more heat from the computer. The problem with this is, while it's great for smaller things like home computers, for big servers, running these fans in order to cool down this water here takes a lot of energy. Companies like ChatGPT are using what's known as evaporative cooling to cool their computers. So how this works is hot air from the computers will be pumped through these tubes here, similarly to the water that was pumped through the other tubes, and to cool these, the water is dropped on top of the tube from these sprinklers. And so this water is going to absorb the heat from the computer and then evaporate upwards, leaving you with cold air that is then sent back to the computer to collect heat and then be cooled down again. The downside to this, however, is that it takes a lot of water to actually do this cooling, because you're basically just pouring water and then having it disperse into the environment here. And it's very hard to actually get this water back. One question that people might ask is, can we actually collect this water that's being dispersed? But the problem with that is, if we wanted to make like a collection system, it would take energy again. Because remember that the reason that we're actually using this water is so that we don't have to spend the energy to cool down the water. But if we wanted to collect the water and bring it back down to a liquid in order to use it again, we'd need to cool down the water, which just takes the same energy. In this situation, water has just been cheaper than the energy required to make the system work, and so they've chosen to use the water. So that explains why ChatGPT needs lots of water. But does it actually use the amount of water as the news is saying? Well, as new data is being collected, we've found that the water usage is notably lower. The amount of water that they're actually using really depends on what study and what source. A lot of big news companies are saying that one ChatGPT prompt uses this much water, which is half a liter. But some other smaller studies are saying that it uses a 1/15 of a teaspoon, which is about these drops here, just for reference. And that is a huge difference. So that really begs the question on whether it's actually impacting the environment, or if it's a really easy story to tell, and that's why big news companies are picking it up because it makes them a lot of money. That being said, that doesn't mean there aren't any environmental impacts of AI. Even with a lower water usage per prompt, there are still hundreds of millions of prompts per day, and that still adds up to a lot of water. And another thing to consider is the energy usage and CO2 emissions. So ChatGPT uses about 300 megawatt hours per day. And according to the Texas government website, 68% of their power comes from non-renewable resources. And accounting for how it's split between natural gas and coal, we get that per megawatt of power used in Texas, 730 kilograms of CO2 are produced. And so if we find how much CO2 ChatGPT creates per year, we get 78,840 tons of CO2 per year. But even though that number is quite high, it's nowhere near the billions of metric tons of CO2 that are emitted each year in Canada and the USA. In the grand scheme of things, ChatGPT only contributes to about 0.00001% of America's total carbon emissions per year. And that's likely to get lower and lower as Texas is transitioning to more clean energy like wind and solar. So, is using ChatGPT really hurting the environment? Well, not by much, but it's still important to be mindful of the impact that our actions have. It's perfectly fine to use it, but it's also good to criticize it too. Even though large news companies exaggerate and use misleading statistics to judge companies, it's still important that we regularly question the practices of large companies to make sure that things aren't getting out of hand. My advice based on this is next time you see something online or hear something from word of mouth that you're not sure if it's true or not, just do some research. Try your best to understand the situation, because making yourself more aware of the world around you is the first step to creating meaningful change. And if we want to get through this environmental crisis, making ourselves more aware and understanding the world around us is the first big step. Thank you for listening.